Well, I'm really thrilled to be with you all today. It's always an honor to be invited to SWW. I've been a member of this organization for at least 17 years. I was trying to remember when I first joined, but I know it's been at least 17 years. Was a former treasurer. And SWW has had a huge impact on a lot of writers' lives and careers, including my own. I was asked to speak about the elements of fiction, and I wondered how I was going to do this so it didn't sound like a college lecture. But you know, when I sat down to write my first book, I thought all that was necessary was to tell a good story. If you had a good story, everything else would fall in place. I couldn't have been more wrong. And as a finance major, I had no background in literature or creative writing. And you know, I could tell you all about economics and statistics and yield curves and so forth. But again, I always had this urge, this crying need to really write a story. And as Larry mentioned, we have a verbal storytelling tradition in our family, mainly because my ancestors couldn't write. But the problem with verbal storytelling is that because of time constraints, you know, if my dad would throw all five of us in one bed every single night, he'd tell a story, and it was a never-ending story, and every night one of the five children was the hero or the heroine of the story. But, you know, 10 or 15 minutes, we start nodding off. So because of time constraints, the stories tended to be plot-driven. But when you're writing a novel, it's not enough to write a plot-driven novel. There are elements of writing that are extremely important that you've got to include. So the first draft of my first manuscript was a plot-driven, story. I thought it was a good story. But I completely ignored things like scene and setting and tone, and even the characters. They almost became second to driving the action. And fortunately, Steve Brewer introduced me to an editor by the name of Frank Zordich. Frank was a former writer with the Albuquerque Tribune. I dubbed Frank Attila the Hun because of his penchant for bleeding all over my manuscript. Frank used a red pen. I learned more from Frank about proper construction of a work of fiction than anything else I've been involved with since I started writing. When constructing a book, there are general rules and guidelines that all writers should follow, regardless of genre. And some of those rules are more important than others. But there are essential ingredients in the book construction menu that can't be ignored, that shouldn't be ignored. And those include character, theme, plot, point of view, setting, conflict, and tone. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So let's get to it. The first item is, Jim, what's the first item? Characters. There are essentially two elements that make up characterization in a novel. The first is the character, him or herself. And you don't have a story without a character, obviously. But a character who's an empty suit, who's a caricature of real people, is almost worse than no character at all. The second element of characterization is the character's makeup, the characteristics of that person. So in order for a story to be real for the reader, and that's what we're talking about here, is how do we make the reader follow us, and how do we make the reader like our characters? The characters must seem real. Characterization is the information the author gives the reader about the characters themselves. And there are several ways to do that. So you reveal what the character's physical appearance is. So this, like I said, this is an obvious element that must be in your work. But it's not enough to say Mabel is beautiful or John is short. That sort of brief description doesn't tell the reader enough. And the vacuum the author creates in that situation is unsatisfying for the reader. So I'm going to read an example that I put in my novel Borderline about how I describe a character. And one of the things I want to point out here is that what I don't want to do is I want the reader to be able to see the character, but I don't want to slow the action down while I'm spending 3 pages describing the character. So here's how I introduced one of my characters. I put detectives Barbara Lassiter and Susan Martinez in an office with a female executive assistant named Judy Turner. So I start. Turner would have looked at home in the executive offices of any Fortune 500 company. Now let's just stop. I haven't said a single thing about the character's appearance, have I? But do all of you have a picture of what this woman might look like? Okay. So I went on to say she accessorized a black dress with a tasteful pearl necklace and expensive black pumps. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a French twist, and her makeup was light. One classy woman, Barbara thought. Now, I could have described the character's, the color of her eyes, her height, her weight, and, whatever, given more information. But I felt that I'd already given the reader enough information to picture the character without slowing down the action. So in addition to physical description, you want to show the character to the reader through what the character says, does, thinks, even dreams. So for example, in Ultimate Betrayal, I wanted to help the reader understand what sort of person my protagonist, David Hood, was. Now, the bulk of the novel occurs when David is married with children. But I wanted to give the reader a feeling for what David thinks. Why does David do things as an adult? What caused him to be the way he is? And so the book starts out in the first chapter. If someone had asked 18-year-old David Hood to define happiness, he wouldn't have had an answer. He couldn't remember what happiness felt like, but he could answer a question about the meaning of life. David knew all about life. Life was hard work, always doing your best, and getting by, just getting by. He also knew what life wasn't. Life wasn't about the triumph of good over evil. So I wanted the reader to wonder, how could an 18-year-old kid be so negative about life? But in doing so, I really kind of set the stage for why David reacted, how he thought, what he did, what he said later on when he loses his family. And there's another reason I did this, and that is that the underlying theme, and we'll talk about the theme in a minute, the underlying theme in all of my books is the triumph of good over evil. But right in the beginning of this book, in Ultimate Betrayal, I tell the reader that I've got a main character that doesn't believe in the triumph of good over evil. So now what I've done is created a conflict construct that kind of gets explained, and what we have now is a situation where how do we get David out of this negative mode? So this by doing so, it added an element of conflict or tension that must be in a work of fiction. Well, the author may reveal a character through what he does or does not do, what others say about him, and how others react to him. I won't give examples here because of time constraints, but it should be enough to say that these are ways for you to inform the reader about your characters. And remember, that's what you're doing. You're informing the reader about your characters. A final comment about characters. I love to use dialogue to describe my characters. Too often we find authors narrating their books, acting as an omniscient narrator. Frank wrote that a lot in the margin of my manuscripts. The thing I like about dialogue is not only do you learn about the character other characters are talking about, but you also learn about the characters who are in the conversation as well. Pardon me. Final word, just remember your characters need to be multi-dimensional, lifelike, and someone or something the reader can relate to and preferably like. So Jean, what's the second element?
A theme.
Theme. I like to think of theme as the underlying message or moral in a novel. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about preaching, although I should tell you that the last time I spoke here, this background was posted, and I got several Facebook questions about when had I taken to change my career and taken to preaching. Those of you who know me know there is little likelihood that that will ever happen. So I like to think of theme as this underlying message or moral. I'm talking about their view of life and the way characters behave and act in the story. For instance, the underlying themes, as I mentioned in all of my books, is the triumph of good over evil. Also, another underlying theme is that people don't act like superheroes. Real people don't leap tall buildings in a single bound. In fact, real people, like real characters, are apt to hesitate, to step back before they wind up jumping into action, if they jump into action. I wanted my readers to relate to my characters because that's the way real people are. I want them to see that they don't, one of the things that drives me crazy is thrillers where characters are dodging bullets. I can tell you that can't be done. When Dan Brown had Robert Langdon jump out of an airplane over the Vatican holding 4 corners of a tarpaulin and floating softly to earth, he lost me. In Shell Game, I write about a man who falls victim to the capital markets meltdown of a decade ago. Edward Winter is a bright, handsome, successful, hard-working businessman whose business is put in dire jeopardy because of the economy and the machinations of a psychopathic investor and a corrupt federal banking official. Edward starts out as a tough guy who approaches his problems with aggression and courage. But as his problems mount and his business survival is in doubt, he falls victim to self-pity. At this point, the reader realizes that Edward could lose everything he's worked so hard for. It's a cliff edge moment when the reader realizes that Edward's not a superhero. Tension builds up in the story. How will Edward react? Does he have the character to persist? Not only is this an example of the roller coaster ride that you want to put your readers on, you give them a break and then you build up the tension until they almost have a heart attack, then you give them a break. But it shows that the way I describe the situation is that it showed that Edward had human traits. That he is just like the reader, an everyday person confronted with a flight or fight situation. Again, this gives the reader the ability to relate not just to your story, but to the character. The theme of a book is essentially the basic truth behind the story, and is often the connection that the reader wants to make with you, the author. So Kurt, what's the next element?
Plot.
Plot is the next element. So the way you arrange your story elements is, in effect, the story's plot. Plot structure can vary from genre to genre. So in a mystery, you know there's been a murder, but it takes you the rest of the book to find out who the murderer was. In a thriller, you usually know who the bad guy is up front, but then the book is all about bringing the bad guy to justice. So again, the structure can be different, but you got to have a plot. But regardless of the way a story's fiction plot develops, it should include the following elements. 1, enough information to understand the story. Not too much, enough. 2, the catalyst that brings on the major conflict. 3, the point in the story when characters try to resolve the conflict. What's that called? Climax. And finally, the resolution that brings the story to a close. Good stories always include all 4 of these plot segments. So, Terry, what's the next element?
Point of view.
Point of view. There always has to be someone between the reader and the story's action. What we hope is that that's not the author. When I first started writing, I essentially narrated my story. Here I was, the omniscient narrator, telling the reader all about the characters, the setting, the plot, and I have to admit, I couldn't get point of view. Couldn't get it. My editor would say, no, POV in the book margin, POV. And I didn't get it. And then when I got it, it was the simplest thing in the world. How many of you have problems with point of view? I can't fix it. I'd be happy to sit down with you sometime, but I can't do it here. It's just like a light goes on and then all of a sudden you got point of view. But I think one of the things you need to do is you need to avoid the role of omniscient narrator. Telling your readers about the characters, settings, plot, etc. It's not an effective way for your readers to get to know your characters. Having your character smell leaking gas and telling them, oh, John smells leaky gas, and showing the reader how he reacts to that leaking gas is the way to do it. Saying John felt sick is not writing. Second, decide whether you're going to write in first person or third person point of view, and don't switch back and forth. If you're John, Tom Clancy or whoever's writing under his name today, you can get away with you can break all the rules, but try not to break that rule. I write in third person point of view. I don't participate in the action as one of the characters, and I do let the reader know how the characters feel. Dennis, what's the next item?
Setting.
Say it again?
Setting.
Setting. The setting is the location of a story's actions. But that's not all it is. It's also the time in which the story occurs. The key parts of setting are not just the place and time, it's also the weather, it's the elements. It's also the social situation. Dress, customs, mannerisms, speech patterns. Gail Loredan's writing a great novel about that takes place in Scotland several hundred years ago. Now imagine you can't write like you've got two people from New York talking in dialogue in that situation. And it also includes mood or atmosphere. Do you create a mood that's frightening, happy, dark? This mood setting can be extremely effective, even more so than describing the interior of a room. How many times have you read a book where they go 3 pages into, the author spends 3 pages telling you what the room looks like, and by the time you finish with the first paragraph, you don't want to read anymore. I don't care about the color of the wallpaper unless there's blood on it. And so that's just an example. I ask myself, Is this setting I'm writing advancing the story and sustaining pace? Or does it slow things down to the point of losing the reader? So, I want to read you an example from Dark Angel, which is my most recent book. Now, my character, Robert Thornton, has his jaw wired, so it's easier in the writing to let the reader realize that his jaw is wired. I'm not going to try and imitate the fact that his jaw is wired, or you'd never be able to hear me. So this is how the book started. Robert Thornton barely suppressed a groan as he turned his head toward the hospital room door. The slight movement shot shards of pain from the top of his head to his ribs. Mr. Thornton, I'm Dr. Sheila Washington. Your surgeon, Dr. Crombie, suggested I come by. You, the shrink? Now, this guy's in bad pain. You, the shrink? He muttered through his clenched, wired jaw. Washington nodded and smiled. I prefer psychiatrist, but shrink will do. You're wasting time here, Doc. Perhaps we could talk for a little bit. Thornton shrugged and grimaced when even that little movement painfully racked his body. How are you feeling today? He pointed at his bandaged face and wired jaw. What do you think? Of course. She paused a second and then asked, how do you feel about what happened? I promised Dr. Crombie I'd speak with you. I always keep my promises. But don't ask stupid questions. Thornton adjusted the oxygen tube in his nostrils and tried to catch his breath. Keeping a promise you made to someone else isn't the ideal motivation to meet with a psychiatrist. You should want to talk with me for your own personal reasons, not because you promised Dr. Crombie. Thornton scoffed. What would you like to accomplish today? To tell Crombie I kept my promise. Washington sighed. That's it? Yeah. Can I call you Robert, or do you prefer Bob? Race. Race? Yeah, father called me that, always racing around as a kid. Okay, Race, answer a question for me. Thornton nodded once. What's the first thing you think about when you wake in the morning? Race closed his eyes and exhaled. Same thing every day, in my dreams and in nightmares. The bastards who murdered wife and daughters. What about them? Finding them. And what if you find them? I'll make them suffer. The way they made Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth suffer. So you want revenge? Thornton stared at the doctor. Whatever. The doctor's professional mask cracked momentarily, then she asked, what other goals do you have? None. We all should have a purpose in life. That purpose should be grounded in the mores and rules of one's society. Thornton scoffed again. I've always obeyed rules, assumed most members of society followed them. I was wrong. We don't get to change the rules if we expect a society to survive. Wrong, Doc. The doctor shook her head. You know what Confucius said about revenge? Thornton, expressionless, continued to stare back. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. I plan to dig more than 2. So that's how Dark Angel starts, and I suspect you all feel that I've set a fairly dark mood. But it sets the reader on a journey of revenge. And as I said, part of setting is all about setting a mood. So Loretta, what's the next element?
Conflict.
Conflict, or what I prefer tension. When I handed that sheet to Loretta, she said, oh good, I'm really good at conflict. Conflict or tension is the essence of fiction. If you don't have conflict, you don't have a work of fiction. And there are 4 kinds of conflict. Conflict between 2 characters. Conflict between the characters and the elements or the forces of nature. Conflict between characters and society, which we just heard a little bit of in Dark Angel. And internal conflict. And I love internal conflict. The wonderful thing about writing about internal conflict is internal conflict is a good test of a character's values. If you read Steve Brewer's work, a lot of his characters have internal conflict. I always worry about Steve because I think, God, if he really knows those characters in real life, he's in real trouble. But regardless of the type of conflict, and there are often multiple types within the same story, conflict enhances the reader's experience and understanding of a character and creates a suspense and interest that makes the reader want to continue reading. So I'll give you another quick example. In Borderline, the conflict begins on page 1. And I give you a warning. Remember I said don't jump around between first person and third person point of view. I violated my rule here. In the prologue and the epilogue, it's first person. Everything in between is third person. You're a joke, a loser, Victoria Comstock said in a razor-sharp tone that slashed at my soul and psyche. Do you really believe you can make me change my plans? She shouted. Venom dripped with each word. Contemptuous laughter burst from her as though a devil exhaled vile breath from deep inside. You're pathetic. She pointed at a nearby wall, at a mounted trophy of a tiny deer no bigger than a small greyhound. You're like that weak, useless animal put on earth to be prey. The emotional pain was bad enough. Now humiliation piled on. I never felt so low, so demeaned. The tears that welled in my eyes only made me feel more useless. I had a sudden need to flee, to put as much distance between me and the woman's words and hateful looks. Then something changed deep down within me. So we don't know anything about the character other than she's conflicted. I mean, we know a lot about Victoria. She is one raving, screaming bitch. But, excuse me, but that's what she is. But the character that's speaking to us, we know nothing about him or her. We don't know sex, we don't know age, we don't know size. All we know is that she's in turmoil. And then something changes like that inside her. And Steve, what's the last element of fiction?
The last element is tone, and Joe said I should say something funny right here, but I got nothing.
At least I didn't give you the microphone. I never would have got it back. Tone is a subtle element that becomes an integral part of an author's voice. Tone provides information to the reader about the meaning of your book. When you have a conversation with another person, you get tone through inflection, facial expressions, body language, and so forth. But you don't have the luxury of those indicators when you're writing a novel. What you're forced to do is depend on the sounds of words, their arrangement, and their sequence. You can use alliteration, you can use irony, imagery, etc. to establish tone. So, another example. In Ultimate Betrayal, here I have a conversation between two mafioso. They speak in the formal style of two old country men who respect and fear one another. There's meter and irony in their conversation, and an almost musical quality. Nice spot for deep thoughts, wouldn't you say, Don Bartolucci? None better, Don Cataldo, none better. It's a perfect place to think about friends and enemies, how to thank and reward one's friends, and how to punish one's enemies. Cataldo looked intently into Bartolucci's eyes. Finally, he smiled. I count myself fortunate. I'm a friend and not an enemy of Don Bartolucci. Don Cataldo, you are much more than a friend. You're a creditor. He patted his chest. This envelope puts me in your debt for the rest of my life. Grazie, Don Bartolucci. Mille grazie. I should have had Terry read this. Missed an opportunity. So that's all there is to writing fiction, right? It's easy. Don't let anybody ever minimize what you're doing. When you write, you're doing God's work. Writing is not something that's created out of thin air, that just comes naturally to a person. You know, like learning to play a musical instrument, or learning to paint, or training to run the 4-minute mile. They all take lots and lots of practice, discipline, and adherence to a set of rules that are often antithetical to what comes naturally. Follow the rules. Ensure that all the appropriate elements are included in your work, and you'll enhance your chances of success. Thank you all very much.